Hi guys, I'm Whitney. Welcome to my channel. Today we're going to talk about some modern science fiction recs. So I've been on a little bit of a classic science fiction kick, and don't get me wrong, I have absolutely loved it. But it's about time that I have some representation on my channel for a lot of the books that really brought me into science fiction, specifically modern science fiction books. Now, how are we defining modern? On my channel, it's going to be the 1990s and beyond, and then anything that's going to be classic is going to be the 80s and before. And this is of course an arbitrary definition, but we gotta have one, so that's my random definition. Let's talk about some modern science fiction books that I have been reading recently that I have been really excited to share. I don't have any special categories for this one, so they're just in random order. The first book is gonna be the first of a trilogy by Ian McDonald called Luna New Moon. Look at how beautiful this cover is. Isn't it gorgeous? This book is really intriguing. It follows one particular family, the Corta family, who is one of the 5 ruling, they call them dragon families of the moon. The head of the family is about to retire, turning over the power of this corporation and the moon to her next generation. However, everyone knows that that is going to be the weakest time in their reign. So of course, all the other dragon families are getting ready to descend on the Corta family. This book was in particular really difficult to get through the very beginning part of it because it was very dry. A lot of the characters were really unrelatable to me. They are very spoiled, terrible people, and it's something that you should know before you get into it. But Ian McDonald saved this novel by starting to insert point of view character chapters from Mama Corta's perspective in terms of flashbacks and how she even built this company from scratch. So you really start to relate to Mama Corta, and through her eyes, you start to then see how her next generation, the spoiled characters I mentioned before, now become a little bit more relatable, especially as the grab for power becomes more intense throughout the book. Now this book ends in a heck of a cliffhanger, and there's tons of action at the very end of this book that was suddenly really hard to follow for otherwise rather dry read. So I have a lot of high hopes for book number 2 and book number 3 of this series because that's when the action started happening. If you really liked Game of Thrones, this is a similar book, although you should know that the characters are a little bit harder to fall in love with than George R.R. Martin's characters, but this book was one ultimately that I do recommend. The next book on our list here is also going to be one that's not for everyone, and that is Wake by Robert Sawyer. You might recognize this author's name or this particular book. I read the entire trilogy. It's called the WWW trilogy. This first book was nominated as a Hugo finalist. Having read all 3 books, I will tell you this is the strongest of the 3 books, and maybe you could stop at the first book if you wanted to, but this book is a weird combination of young adult on top of adult science fiction. So just know that you're walking the fence line with this book and kind of go into it expecting that. In this book, we're following a teenager, Caitlin, who has been blind since birth, and she and her family have moved to Canada, where a opportunity falls into her lap to use this new technology that's been developed to allow her to see. However, this new technology has quite a few interesting side effects, and one of them includes seeing the internet. There's also some other things that happen that I'm not going to go into, but suffice it to say that this book does go into some AI concepts, robotics, and shouldn't we kind of technology issues. I also really thought that this book did a really interesting job of representing a disabled main character, which is not something that we see a whole lot in science fiction, although luckily we're seeing more and more. I also want to point out that according to a couple of the reviews on Goodreads who claim to be blind readers, he didn't do the best of jobs representing blind people in the book. However, it was more of an eye-opening book for me than other books have been. I also thought that this author did a considerable amount of research on Helen Keller. And in many ways, this book seems to be a love letter to Helen Keller in ways that I don't want to go into. So consider this first book, Wake. Finally, a culture book. That's right, you guys. I read Player of Games by Ian Banks. So this is my very first culture novel. I got scared away from Consider Phlebas by several of my friends who said that it was just really hard to keep track of and to get into. Don't worry, I have ordered Consider Phlebas and Use of Weapons. So I will be continuing with this culture series. Now in this book, we're following a master game player who wins at almost every game that he's ever played. He's just been playing since he was a very young age, and he's a very clever person who's bored with the lack of challenge that his life now gives him. He becomes contacted by this unknown person and invited to the Azad Empire, which is on the very edge of the culture series, and I'm not exactly sure where that is. And he gets invited to play this big game of theirs that has very high stakes. It's so complex that they train their entire lives to play this game, and after playing it, the winner becomes the emperor and the losers can lose some of their lives. He's so intrigued by this idea of a challenge and finding out if some of the things that he's learned from his culture can apply to other cultures, that he accepts the invitation without really thinking about consequences or without any instruction in the game. As you can imagine, this game is a little bit more intense than he expects, and not all things have been revealed until we get to the end of the book. There's a lot to be found in this book, and despite how interesting some of the game was, they don't do a good job explaining to the reader what the rules of the game are. And I do think that that was something that I did not enjoy about this book. I wish they had, invited the reader in to be a little bit more of a part of the game. I do think that this ending makes up for it. I do think that it was a little bit of a slower book. I am really intrigued about the culture series now, and I do think that I would recommend this book. So for any of you out there who are interested in the culture series, this is a great place to start, at least so far. The next one on here is Elizabeth Moon's Remnant Population. This is a book that has been on my radar for a little bit, although I'm not exactly sure where I heard about this one. I think that this is one of my favorite reads as of recently. This book is a character study science fiction novel about Ophelia, who is a 70-year-old woman. She's a colonist on an alien planet who decides that she has had her life, her family doesn't need her anymore, and she decides to stay behind on the planet when all of the colonists get pulled off the alien planet to abandon essentially the planet. And so she decides to live out the rest of her few years completely alone with no expectations. And she's so relatable because she's that person who just doesn't want to be around anybody. And she's not lonely, she's not sad about it, she's thrilled. She may or may not be walking around naked on the planet. She has such a good time. This book was a really interesting read because Ophelia is not as alone as she thinks she is. I'm not exactly sure how Elizabeth Moon came up with this idea. I also think that somehow she made these everyday activities of the 70-year-old woman incredibly enjoyable to read about. This was not a boring book by any means, and I just found this to be such a cozy modern science fiction read that I would recommend this book to a lot of people just because I loved how cantankerous Ophelia was. I loved how relatable it was, that she just doesn't want to deal with anybody and she just wants to have her way and she wants everyone to leave her alone. And I really loved this story. It was such a breath of fresh air, and it's one that I haven't really come across ever before. So if you're really curious about Elizabeth Moon, or if you're interested in a story like this, I would highly, highly recommend this one. The next book on this list is going to be Ninefox Gambit by Yoon-ha Lee. This is the first of a trilogy that I'm surprised more people aren't talking about. First of all, the font they use in this book is amazing, and I know that makes me kind of a book snub, but oh my gosh, it's so pretty. This book is a space opera that kind of reminds me a little bit of Memory Called Empire. In this one, we're following a girl named Captain Kel Cheris, who has never really quite fit in as the Kel soldier that she is supposed to be. However, she gets asked to host an unstable mind of a long dead general that her civilization is hoping will be able to beat this unwinnable war that they are trying to survive in the middle of this intergalactic space war between two different empires. And she, Kel Cheris, with the undead general, General Jadao, is supposed to be able to use his mind and his strategy to be able to win this epic battle. However, as she gets to know this general and his tactics and his past, she starts realizing that the players and the things that she's fighting for are maybe a little bit different than she's been told. And now she put herself in a position where she has to make an impossible choice. This book is a really good start to a trilogy. I immediately went out and bought the other two books. I have really enjoyed this series, and if you like Memory Called Empire, this is one that I would highly, highly, highly recommend. Next on our list is one you might have seen on my Instagram recently, and that is Semiosis by Sue Burke. So this book really surprised me. This one was not on my radar and just kind of popped up in one of my library Audible feeds, and I stopped the Audible book. I call all audiobooks Audible books. I stopped it in mid-feed and ordered the book because I loved it so much. It's a very unusual first contact book. This book follows 3 generations of human colonists as they have gone to an alien planet and they're trying to survive. And of course, they have to survive with the alien foliage and all of the environmental things that are happening on the planet, along with trying to eke out a living. And there's so many survivalist themes in this book. We also have first contact, which may or may not be a good thing. And we're following the alien perspective throughout the book, as well as the human colonists. And I really enjoyed this one. I have to say that there is a second book out there. I'm definitely trying to get my hands on it. If you're into first contact and also a little bit of environmental survivalists, this one is a really interesting read. It's got a very unique alien species, and I loved reading from their perspective. If you're in for something of a different kind of book, this might be one for you. Next on this list is a book that I have championed on many other channels, but I haven't really gotten a chance to talk about here, and that is, of course, going to be Mountain in the Sea by Ray Naylor. This is easily the best 2022 new release that I read last year. This is a book that I plan to nominate for a Hugo Award, so definitely we'll see how that goes through. I think it was in the finalists for the Nebula Award this year. It is a fantastic philosophical, ethical, contemplative book. It really goes into lots of details about biology and anatomy. It just does a lot of really cool stuff. It's a first contact novel without aliens. So this is following Dr. Wynn, who is a biologist who discovers that a very rare octopus species down in the South Hemisphere is actually sentient. And we don't know if we just missed this or if this is just now happening, but we're trying to communicate with this species with Dr. Wynn's perspective. In the meanwhile, on the global and corporate scale, all of the powers that be start to get a whiff that this species might be sentient, and they are vying for control over the island and the little ocean area that this species is living in, because they know that this could mean some significant technological changes for humankind. And not all of these companies have the octopus's best interest at heart. So there is this big overarching political corporate battle for this area. In the meanwhile, We also have the battle to communicate with them in terms of these octopuses don't have ears, they don't have mouths the way that we do, they don't have digestion the way that we do, so how is it that we can possibly communicate with them? And Dr. Wynn goes through all of the different things in very specific detail in this book. I know that sounds a little bit boring. I'm probably doing a bad job explaining how awesome this book was, but for somebody like me who's in the medical field, I really enjoyed how much biology mattered in this book. I also really enjoyed how much philosophy that we talk about in this book. This is one that I would highly recommend you pick up. I don't think that you're going to be sad about it, and it's definitely one of my favorite reads, so please check it out. All right, now we get into the next book, Embassytown by China Miéville. Wow, this book is Alien First Contact, and it is taking place in a far-flung future, and it's really, I don't know how to say, unlike anything I've ever read before. It's really dense. It's really heavy on the themes. There's so many themes that I could probably write an essay about this book. That's how heavy it is. I know for sure that when I finished it, I didn't catch everything. It almost demands a reread or two to really get and understand what Miéville was really talking about in this book. It's asking a lot of questions about language and language's place in our understanding of the world, in our mindset, in our frame of references and perspectives, and what that means for not just humankind, but all of the universe. There's so many other themes that this book covers, including things like human selfishness and what our legacy or imprint on the universe and the things that we get involved in are. Are all humans meant to destroy everything we touch? Is greed the main motivating factor of humanity? And so many more. This is easily one of the most impactful books as far as first contact and how humans affected a particular alien species and culture. And I don't even know if it's a positive or a negative thing. I will tell you that Miéville's ability to write prose is spectacular. You're gonna feel like you understand a lot of the words he's using, but then when he puts them in sentences, you just get mildly confused, because I feel like mild confusion is a normal state to read this novel. If you wanna have some big discussions, this is definitely one of the books that you should pick up. It's not always comfortable, it's not always a great picture, but it would be something like nothing else out there. So this is definitely a book that I highly recommend you pick up. Come talk to me about this on Discord. I have so many questions to ask you. So come check it out. Another really spectacular discussion book is Oryx Crake by Margaret Atwood. This is the first of her Mad Adam trilogy. I picked this book up because I had just read The Handmaid's Tale by her. That was such a cool book. I really enjoyed that one. I really liked her characters. I really liked the writing and what she said about sex and gender and the power of women and reproduction. I couldn't wait to see what kind of post-apocalyptic things that she brought up in this book. This was different than I expected because it is quite a bleak outlook. I gotta tell you, I don't think anyone has ever outdone Margaret Atwood in terms of bleak futures and how unrecognizable humanity becomes in this novel. We alternate perspectives in this novel following Snowman, who used to be known as Jimmy, and we get to see some flashbacks of humanity's twilight and how we went down, as well as the unrecognizable future world, with Jimmy being one of the last humans left. There's so many things in here that are almost too true that they're so painful. We get to see a lot of things that I think we should talk about as potential trigger warnings. There's a lot of pornography references, the torture of animals for people's entertainment. We see sexually exploiting children, which is commonplace. We see, there's just, this book really explores the dark side of humanity in a way that made me uncomfortable reading it on the page. And it's weird because it's not really as graphic as you might think. The descriptions are not incredibly graphic, but how people rely on them for their entertainment is just difficult to get through. This book is not a fun read by any chance. It's one that I feel like I constantly had to put down and go do something else because it was really hard for me to face what humanity is in this book, and it almost made me happy to see that humanity didn't make it, which is not probably the outcome that she's looking for, or maybe it is. I do think that I will continue with this series because there's so many things to talk about in this book, and I do recommend it in terms of themes to talk about. There are things that are uncomfortable that are worth reading so that way we can have a discussion. So that's why it's on this list. I do recommend, but I do think that you should be ready for a very disturbing read. And last, but definitely not least, is an Octavia Butler, first of the trilogy, Dawn. You guys, this book was not expecting it. Was not expecting. If you have not yet read Octavia Butler, I think this would be a really spectacular first Octavia Butler novel. I also think that this is like diving into the deep end. So if you're not ready for that, don't pick this one up. But this is some of the most unique alien first contact I have ever seen. This is some of the most unique aliens of all time that I have ever seen. And there are so many interesting themes in this book that I actually got Matt from Bookpilled to have an entire discussion with me about it. So definitely be on the watch out for that video. This is a book that I feel like everyone could talk about in a book club. I feel like there's so many themes here about anti-colonialism, slavery, consent. Everything in this novel has 4 or 5 deeper meanings. And it's so interesting to see how we're following Lilith, who has been essentially kidnapped from the planet with the rest of humanity by an alien species called the Oankali. And the Oankali have saved us from our terrible planet. And in return, we now owe them. I do have to say this book really has deep themes about conspiring with the enemy and what choices do we really have, and is survival really worth it? There's so many other deeper themes to talk about in this book that I highly recommend. Of all the books that we talked about today, it is so good. I can't wait to pick up the next 2 books in the series because it's only a trilogy. High recommend. What did you think about these modern science fiction recommendations? If you have any that I haven't covered or that you want me to read, please let me know in the comments down below. And if you want to talk about some of these books with me, which I really want to talk about with you, please come check us out in the Discord. We have a whole channel dedicated just to modern science fiction. I would love to hear about what you're reading. I would love to hear about what you thought of these novels or what books you recommend. Until next time, you guys.